Less is more. I can't think of any video game that encapsulates this little maxim better than the Panzer Dragoon series. We peer into this vast, strange and fascinating fantasy world through a keyhole, and it seems all the more filled with fantastical possibilities because of it. Created by a team of approximately 15 people, a size that's today often associated with indie game development, Sega's Team Andromeda took a simple yet compelling premise, that of a rider and his dragon facing off against a mysterious empire, to quite magnificent heights. In 1998 I was already under the spell of Panzer Dragoon Zwei, and to a slightly lesser extent the original Panzer Dragoon. Part Space Harrier, part Dune, part Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Me and my big brother played Zwei together in 1996 and were kind of mesmerised by the game's outstanding art design, slick, intense, rhythmic action, and we were confused and fascinated in equal turns by its opaque storytelling. It was a technical tour de force for the Sega Saturn and the 32-bit generation as a whole, and demonstrated the fantastic possibilities that full 3D environments could present us with. In 1998, with the Saturn having been smashed to bits in sales terms by the PlayStation, I read about an upcoming Panzer Dragoon RPG game in the official Sega Saturn magazine. I first played Panzer Dragoon Saga at age 14, courtesy of the demo disc on the cover of that magazine. These were kinda desperate times for Sega, and they decided to give away the entire first disc of the game. None other than Richard In the Here and Now Bespoke Ledbetter had a big role to play in this, apparently, and what do you know, his name is right here in the end credits. I found the first disc completely absorbing and I wanted very much to play more of it, but being 14 and not having a job, and with the much deeper pockets of my big brother having gone off to university miles away by this point, I missed out on the full game at the time. Former Sega of America employee Chris Lucic, along with Matt Underwood, worked as a lead tester and text editor for Panzer Dragoon Saga's North American release, and they framed the whole Sega gaming landscape for us in an article in TheRinger.com a few years ago. That project was in a very strange transitional period for Sega, Underwood says. The Saturn was pretty much dead, employees were fleeing the company, and personally I pretty much figured it was going to be the last thing I did for Sega. Those final US releases were just painful, because they were all great games, but Sega had moved on to developing the Dreamcast. Worse still, Sega was expecting Saga to sell in the millions and compete with PlayStation's flagship RPG, Final Fantasy VII. But Final Fantasy VII had come out a year earlier and had an enormous development and marketing budget behind it, and had become a huge hit, going on to sell more than 10 million copies worldwide. Saga simply may not have had the crowd-pleasing potential of Square's classic. As Underwood says, the Panzer Dragoon world was used up and the people were just trying to survive. It was more Mad Max than Sonic. We ended up basically positioning the game as the polar opposite of PlayStation's big RPG in tone. It was also facing competition from Grandia, another well-loved Saturn RPG that beat it to market by more than a month. For those reasons, or others, Saga disappointed Sega by selling only 110,000 copies in Japan. According to Underwood and Lucic, only 20,000 North American copies were produced in Saga's initial run. After those sold out in 2 days, between 2,000 and 5,000 more were made. Then, the tap turned off forever. Former Sega Europe employee David Nolte recalls an extremely small run of roughly 1,000 copies being ordered in Europe, hence why it's so frickin' expensive. This is an absolutely bizarre situation when we consider the fact that this is one of the most ambitious, beguiling gaming experiences ever crafted by human hands. I do have very dim memories of seeing a copy of this game in my local branch of Game, jammed unceremoniously on a bottom shelf in a corner of the shop with no fanfare to be seen whatsoever. The Saturn was basically dead. Branches of Game often wouldn't put any Saturn games in their shops at all. Now it's worth a fortune, of course. I didn't get to play the full thing until about 12 years ago, when I happened across it in a second-hand shop in Manchester city centre for the princely sum of £100. Even back then it was easily worth double that on eBay, and I eagerly gave the little Asian dude behind the counter my money. I left the shop and went to Tesco Metro to toast my victory with a chicken teriyaki wrap and a Whisper Gold, and immediately went and left the fucking thing behind at the self-service checkouts. I strolled back down Market Street, dodging the drug-addled crazies and charity fundraisers as usual, with a rather smug look on my face, and almost had a stroke when I realised I'd left the bag behind. I legged it back to the shop, and to my amazement some absolute legend had put it in the back for safekeeping. The Holy Grail was swiftly returned to me. Thank you, Phil. I will always love you. It's possibly my most treasured gaming possession, and here it is, deep inside my cupboard of joy/shame. Anyway, enough bollocks. The creator of the series, Yukio Futatsugi, has described the origins of the Panzer Dragoon series. The series owed debts to a smattering of sci-fi fantasy works from Futatsugi's formative years: Dune, Mad Max, Hayao Miyazaki's Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, the French animated series Le Monde Englouti, Brian Aldiss' novel The Long Afternoon of Earth, and Arzac and the Incal comics by the French artist and writer Jean Giraud, aka Mobius, who created original artwork for Panzer Dragoon, including the first game's Japanese cover art. By all accounts, Panzer Dragoon Saga was an extremely difficult project to complete. 2 staff members died during development, with the director Yukio Futatsugi attributing them at least in part to stressful working conditions. All we could do was carry on and finish the game, he says. It was out of my hands. Part of me did not want to stop though. That was definitely the toughest project I've ever worked on. Personal relationships became strained, the stress was overwhelming. Akiko Mukayama, the battle planner on Saga, had this to say: "The number of directors on this game had a high turnover, but Kusanagi-san was the last director and he saw the project to completion. He was originally the art director. He was still under a lot of pressure as well and struggled to keep the project moving forward. There was a time when he really looked blue and sad, but there's something that he said that I remember to this day. Like I mentioned, I was really depressed because nothing seemed to work and Kusanagi-san was struggling too. But one day he called me into his office looking elated and he said, 'I got it, I figured it out.' So I thought maybe he'd come up with a solution or something. But instead, he says, 'If this project fails, it's just the end of Sega. It's no big deal. I feel so much better.' Futatsugi tells us that the hardest thing about the project was that for the time we took on too many challenges at once. The game was in full voice, meaning we had voiceovers for all the characters' dialogue in the game. We also put in a 3D real-time processing for the whole game. At the time, real-time processing was common in cutscenes and action clips, but nobody had made an entire game using real-time 3D. That in and of itself was a huge challenge. We also had to convert what was originally a shooting game and make it into a good RPG. Each challenge seemed doable, but because we tried to do so much all at once, it was really, really tough. What about the game itself and its characters? Futatsugi cites Kramen as his favourite character. The morally ambiguous primary antagonist of Saga begins the game by slaughtering the mercenaries who protected the excavation site where the character Azel, a drone created long ago in the ancient age, resides. Edge, our main character, swears vengeance upon Kramen, but later on in the game his true cause is revealed and things become a little grey. Futatsugi said this: "We originally had a great deal more scenes planned for Kramen. We wanted to show more about his past and the reason why he rebelled against the Empire. However, we calculated that adding all that would have nearly filled the entire first disc, so we had no choice but to cut most of it. That's why Kramen has no scenes between his early appearance and the second half of the game. He has the most thematic presence of all the characters, so it's all the more of a shame. We also had this idea for a scene where after Kramen dies in the tower, his henchmen would talk about what he was trying to do. It was always a battle with available memory, and there were many things we couldn't include in the game. But because we did depict other things with great detail and care, I think players who diligently gather all the info and hints scattered around the world will be able to imagine what was left unsaid. In fact, this guessing is one of the fun things in this game. Kusanagi suggests that one of the features of the Panzer Dragoon series is that in the games we reveal only 1/5 of the total world we've actually created. That's to leave space for players' imaginations and to allow players to enjoy talking with each other and comparing the different experiences they've had. Players' opinions are bound to diverge, and that's a good thing. We think it's an important part of making the world of Panzer Dragoon feel more real. I couldn't agree more. The battle system in Panzer Dragoon Saga is pretty unique and pretty awesome in my opinion. So how did it come about? Well, Dragon designer Satoshi Sakai tells us that the battle system was recreated so many times. At first the camera moved around the enemy 360 degrees, then it switched to using a cubic frame where the player moved around the enemy on 4 frames. I can't even remember the number of times we had to recreate the game, so all that recreating probably led to a lot of stress on the team. Battle planner Akiko Mukayama, I'm sure I've seen an anime called that once, said that the programmers were very proud and had a lot of motivation from just completing a high-end shooter in Zwei, so they wanted to make another shooting game. The artists, on the other hand, wanted to make use of the 3D technology and show off cool graphics in an RPG. They wanted to spin the camera as much as possible to show all the angles of the 3D characters they created. Their motivation and end goal was totally different from those of the programmers. I didn't think there could possibly be a solution to satisfy both parties. Making a real-time 3D game on this sort of scale was bonkers for its day. Kusanagi said that in terms of technical abilities, the use of scrolling was unique to the Saturn. The PlayStation had polygon capabilities, but the Saturn didn't. So on Sega's console, what you had to do was to mould a picture into 3D. So in other words, we didn't have to create a polygon model that didn't have any textures on it. We were able to create images that had more depth to them as a result. I didn't think of it at the time, but our mentality was not that we couldn't do something on the Saturn, but that we could do anything if we got creative. And the designers, I think, found purpose in overcoming these shortcomings. Mr. Sakai, who designed the player's dragon, was incredible in his ability to maximize the Saturn in ways that nobody thought possible, so the limitations actually helped them make something better. This game is more ambitious than even Panzer Dragoon Zwei, but it's true that the limitations of the Saturn hardware are exposed to a greater degree at times. We see frame drops fairly frequently, although that kind of thing is very common in 3D games of this vintage, and I don't find it much of a hindrance myself. What's more problematic is the draw distance. Polygons clip into view very close to the player at times. But the developers were really running into the cold hard realities of the Saturn hardware. Despite all this, the game is truly beautiful. One of the things that stands out to me is the use of colour in this game. It has an absolutely beautiful and highly distinctive palette. Everything's kind of rusty or iridescent looking, and at times it even looks kind of luminous. Almost like Rec 2020 colour palettes to my eye, even though that's obviously not the case. These unusual and distinctive hues are very much part of the Sega Saturn look. For me, it's also evident in games like Nights into Dreams, and particularly the original Tomb Raider. But in this game, it's put to use in a very concerted and considered manner, and the results are awesome. Just look at this scene in the caravan, where if you just stand around and look out across the desert, you can see the time of day shift, and with it the whole colour palette. It happens so subtly that unless you're looking for it, it's almost imperceptible, but you can see that by late afternoon the palette has shifted quite dramatically. It's little touches like this that make this game so magical. In fact, I recall an interview with one of the devs in the Saturn magazine way back in the day saying that this game couldn't have been done on the PS1 because of the unique way the Saturn handled colour. It truly looks like nothing else to this day. The 3D in this game is very basic indeed by today's standards, kind of nascent even. They were trying to pull off something extremely ambitious here in what was really still the early days of real-time 3D. Most games of this time, including smash hits like Final Fantasy VII and the Resident Evil series, were still mixing 2D backgrounds with 3D characters overlaid. Even the environments on N64 games were quite constricted in comparison for the most part. Hyrule Field in Ocarina of Time was considered an absolute marvel, and that was released the best part of a year later than Saga and on considerably more powerful hardware than the Saturn, and it's only comparable to the size of the areas here. To try and pull off the sweeping environments of Panzer Saga on the Saturn was nuts, and I love them for it. The chunky details, wobbly 3D and low-res textures renders many of these scenes in this game almost abstract. What you're really left with is an impression of this world, the idea of it, not the reality of it. Roger Ebert once said of Japanese animation, and I think it applies here too.
And it occurred to me that if you did make it live action, it would probably look something like, or could look something like, an Italian neorealist film, maybe something by De Sica or Rossellini, somebody like that. And it'd be kind of bogged down in realism. Maybe it would be a very good film. I'm not saying it wouldn't be a good film, but it wouldn't be as pure or as abstract or as kind of crystallized as the anime approach allows. In the case of Grave of the Fireflies, and any anime film as far as I'm concerned, what happens is the emotion is underneath the art. It doesn't matter that these don't look exactly like people that we see in the real world, because we quickly begin to read them as the people in the real world of this movie, as the characters in this movie. And we identify with them, and with their predicament, and with their personalities, and with what they try to do.
Of course, this wasn't intentional on the part of the developers, it was due to technical and budgetary limitations, and of course this kind of stuff doesn't apply to games like FIFA 98 or Need for Speed Underground, of course. But in a game of this nature, in a weird way, I actually think this simple, almost impressionistic quality actually elevates the experience in some ways. For a start, it arguably makes the incredible art design and music stand out all the more. For another, if the technology had been there, then to render this world in extreme detail would have required an absolutely enormous team similar to the ones we have today, which I suspect often ends up diluting the experience quite a bit. This is the work of a relatively small team, with a high level of creative control. I think that's one reason why some of these old games, despite their rudimentary graphics, coupled with their comparatively focused, stripped-down game world structure and gameplay styles, are at times actually more evocative than many modern games with their incredibly detailed landscapes. Of course, nostalgia does have its role to play in this, but the reason we still see pixel games or games with pared down, even abstract art styles is not purely down to that. In certain situations, it absolutely is the more effective way of communicating a setting, a concept, or a mood to the player.
丈夫かな。
Is there any subtext at work in this game? Well, I think the strongest element of this game is the world building and the art design and the music, but as you get further into the game, certain themes do start to emerge. The antagonists in Panzer Dragoon Saga are all rather high-minded, ideological, and maybe even hubristic, and all of them get killed. The Imperials, of course, want to harness the power of the Ancients and conquer the world, defeat the monsters, and thus free mankind from the deadly artificial creatures deployed by the Ancients to keep their numbers down. In the end, their flagship, the Grig Orig, is infested with these very monsters and has to be brought down by the player. The character Vyman or Vayman in the town of Zoa wants to destroy the Imperials. He has Edge and his dragon destroy the nearby Imperial base. He celebrates, but he is soon killed himself by the Empire in retaliation, along with the rest of the town. Kramen's motives are somewhat more sympathetic. He believes the ancient tech that the Imperials are using should never be wielded by man. They belong in the ancient world. The ancient tech and the monsters it brings forth are there for good reason, to keep untrustworthy humans in check, so to speak. His mission is to stop the Imperials at any cost, and in the end he and the Emperor are both killed by one of these monsters. In the end, Edge shacks up with the Seekers. You could claim that the character Gash is kind of ideological too in a sense, but to me his sort of pattern of thought seems the most grounded and intuitive, if you will. The Seekers are common people who have suffered at the hands of the monsters unleashed by the ancient technology firsthand. He simply wants man to own his own destiny, to be truly alive for the first time in God knows how long, to get rid of the Ancient One's administrative systems, inverted commas. I suppose thinking about it, you could also say that the Ancients themselves were a little high-minded and hubristic also. Edge himself swears vengeance upon Kramen, but he does ultimately pull back from this. He prevails, it seems at least, and the towers are deactivated. Humans will now have to go forth into the world and see what they can make of themselves. This is truly one of gaming's great idiosyncratic gems. Spending an hour or two just puts me in a zen-like state. It's an absorbing, unique, kaleidoscopic game. I actually played most of it in Japanese a long time ago with the aid of a translation guide, but it wasn't until I finally got to play through it in English on my Saturn that I really grasped just how completely captivating this thing is. I've never been a completionist when it comes to computer games, but this is one of those rare titles where I can't help but go and seek out all the little secret nuggets littered around the game world, like helping the little boy Enkak at the caravan get over his fever by fetching a special stone from Uru, then coming back several hours later and finding that he's starting to recover, or recovering the little dragon pup from the Shelkuf site and using it later in the game to obtain the ultimate form of your dragon, the Solo Wing, otherwise known as Winged Death. What an awesome name. There are many of these awesome little flourishes, and it extends to the settlements themselves, which are beautiful and intricate, particularly for a real-time 3D game from 1998. Director Futatsugi has said that he wants players to enjoy the conversations with the people in town. I was thinking of the visual novel game Do Kyusei in that regard. I've probably mangled that name there, I do apologise. I wanted the information the NPCs give you to change each time you talk to them, and for your conversation to have an effect on them. You'll really get the most out of Panzer Dragoon Saga by talking to all the people in the caravan and the various towns. Gina Tsukahara, the city designer, tells us that the first thing we focused on was figuring out the culture behind the cityscapes that we were creating. We were told the cities were in desolate areas, so we decided not to make windows on the buildings, and we made the outside materials of the buildings something that looked like clay or rocks. We decided on things like putting staircases on the outside of buildings for no reason, but it looks kind of cool and fitting. So first, we made some ground rules regarding the look and feel of the city. Once that was established, we decided what the people living in this kind of city would look like, what kinds of jobs and tools would they need and use, what would their utensils and food look like. We started with the general culture and lifestyle of the entire city, and then added details to fit the story. The cutscenes are also great. At the time, they were absolutely stunning. Masahiro Kumono, the ending CG movie creator, has said that the CG was very new at the time, so this work was really cutting edge. Even within Sega, this title was an artier title than most, in that there were lots of artists involved in the game. Back then, the quality of the visuals was still very low, and we didn't have the facilities that CG departments have today, but the game included relatively long CG movies. In retrospect, I think this was quite ambitious of Team Andromeda. The music of Panzer Dragoon Saga is uncanny and incredible, fusing synthesizers and tribal beats in a really ethereal mix. I always thought it walked the line between digital and organic. At the time, I couldn't quite put my finger on what I was listening to, and to me this kind of reflected all the bioengineered creatures in this world, and Azel herself too, of course. Sari Kobayashi, the composer, had this to say: "I had to create a particular type of music for the first time ever, so I ended up listening to ethnic folk music from all around the world. I hope the music is reflective of the story. I want the music to make people curious about the game's story and encourage them to play the game. That's really what I wanted to capture in the music. I hope that my music will inspire the listener to expand their imagination and take them on a journey." Lots of people like the score of the original game the best. I don't, personally, although the opening track is amazing. Zwei was the first game in the series that I played, and I just loved its otherworldly feel. Apparently, Mr. Futatsugi had his own vision and direction for the music. The music in the first game wasn't tailored to his taste, so he worked very closely with the composer for the second game, Zwei, to make sure that the music reflected the worldliness of the game. The ending of the game is famously ambiguous. Chris Lucic, along with Matt Underwood, worked as lead testers and text editors for Panzer Dragoon Saga's North American release, and that's the translation I played myself in the UK. In one of its closing cutscenes, the game breaks the fourth wall, revealing that the Divine Visitor referenced throughout the story is in fact the player, who, in powering up the system, reanimates Edge. At the end of the game, the text instructs the player to press the button, that is, finish the game and power down the system, thereby stranding or erasing Edge. Sega of America never received translated text for the post-credits cutscene, in which Azel sets off to find Edge, so Lucic spun it how he saw it. I figured the best ending was for Azel, who was an immortal guardian, to search the world forever and never find her first love, he says. If anyone has a more literal translation from the Japanese of this ending, I would certainly love to hear it. Kusanagi has said that he purposely left it ambiguous for the players to make their own interpretation of what happens at the end. When he was making the game, the assumption was that Edge is shot dead at the beginning of the story, but the player's involvement with the game brings Edge back to life. It's all very meta, but he wanted to give the player that feeling that this other Panzer world might really exist. I think this quote from Katsumi Yokota, the character designer, sums things up quite nicely. I do think that Panzer Dragoon Saga was a unique role-playing game. Final Fantasy VII was made and designed for the mass market, whereas Panzer Dragoon Saga was a more niche and quirky game. The people on the dev team were not the type of people who liked mass-market mainstream products. They were niche, alternative, rock and roll, and avant-garde. From the beginning of the production, there was an element of fighting against the norm and trying to create something that was counter to what was expected in every aspect of the development. And that is what has led to the creation of such a unique game that has transcended time and is still talked about 20 years later. This game really leaves you wanting more in the best possible way. There is so much more of this world to see. Sometimes I imagine just wandering around the gigantic imperial city that we only see briefly in cutscenes, only rendered in a modern engine on a vast scale. Imagine that. Fat chance of it happening, of course, but hey, we can dream, can't we? That being said, going right back to my opening gambit for this little video, sometimes at least, less is more. The fact that we really only get a tantalizing glimpse of this world piques my interest all the more. Contrast this with many open world games where you're allowed to do everything, inverted commas, and frequently find yourself banging your head against the outer edges of the map, or are confronted by procedurally generated NPCs, or find that this gigantic and immaculately rendered world feels weirdly empty and kind of lifeless. We don't see much of it, I grant you, but every element of Panzer Dragoon Saga is handcrafted and carefully considered, dripping with detail, and really has been brought to life by the development team.
Tak. Veritas!
Toen is je zou de laus te quellaus. Toen is to enor paticitas zoor. Agor visgina to es. Toen si. Civitas te feng jade turansiu. Toen es to intersevernia. Laus decesifir lofisa es a mutus.
As I've described too many times on this channel, there was something uniquely magical about the late days of old Sega for my money. I read the official Saturn magazine right till the bitter end, and the last few issues I remember them featuring more and more import reviews and previews just to fill out the pages. It was a strange, lonely, kind of magical experience, and it stays with me to this day. It was a similar experience just 3 years later in the dying days of the Dreamcast, seeing games like Panzer Dragoon Saga and Shenmue 2, mammoth, technologically groundbreaking games absolutely weeping with love, care and imagination, get released to an almost non-existent audience was a bittersweet experience. Exploring these fantastical worlds was also kind of eerily wonderful if you were one of the few who played them at the time. This is one of those games that's really a unique product of its time. In the late 90s, the gaming industry was quite different to that of today. Games were just beginning to receive larger budgets and to become greater in scope. However, dev teams were still relatively small. They still had a lot of creative control, a relic of an earlier era, and mid-budget games had not yet been squeezed out of existence by the economic realities of a booming industry. Complex real-time 3D graphics had only just become a reality, and ways of interacting with these brave new worlds had yet to be codified. That led to a lot of strange, fascinating, and highly imaginative games. In the case of Sega specifically, this and the Shenmue games were truly a case of heart over mind, I think. These titles were a last roll of the dice for the Sega of old as it hovered on the brink of a financial precipice. With an almost kamikaze-like zeal, they threw absolutely everything they could muster at the audience, but unfortunately, it just wasn't quite enough. These enormously ambitious, expensive and esoteric products were ill-advised from a financial perspective, but from a creative one, they were quite magnificent, which is one of the reasons why they still resonate with people today, despite selling relatively little at the time. As the director himself said, there was relatively little regard given to market trends or financial bottom lines. They simply wanted to make the best game they could possibly make, and by God, they certainly did that. They were young and they were naive and they were filled with talent and inspiration, and it absolutely shows. Panzer Dragoon Saga, a game born of blood, sweat, tears and death, its troubled development period really doesn't show. Or maybe it does, depending on your perspective. For my money, this is quite possibly the most beguiling setting in video game history, and it is one of gaming's few genuine masterpieces.